Hello, I'm Pamela Burstler, the Executive Director of Pacific Horticulture Society, and I'm delighted to be here today to introduce you to our newest program called the Digital Classroom. This is a series of talks and presentations on environmental science topics, and we're bringing them into the realm of horticulture, gardening, and landscape. I think you'll enjoy them. The first 5 topics in this series are supported by a grant from the Pendleton and Elizabeth Carey Miller Charitable Foundation. We thank them very much for their support of this program. Now, you can find all of the topics that we're going to be discussing over the next year or so at pacifichorticulture.org/digital classroom. And there will be links there so that you can watch all the videos. Also, you can send us an email asking questions, finding more resources, connecting to our archives. You can send that email to digitalclassroom@pachort.org. Again, digitalclassroom@pachort.org. So today's presentation, I'm the lucky person to be presenting it to you. And if you'll give me just a second, I'll get the screen share up and we'll launch into our topic. Today's topic is going to be about the gardener as superhero. Now, it doesn't really matter where you live, whether it's in British Columbia or Washington State or Oregon or Northern California or Southern California, anywhere within the Pacific horticulture territory. Every time you drink a glass of water or you use water in your home, you are taking something that has passed through a landscape. And I think this is something very interesting for us to begin to think about. And that is that there's a connection that all of us have through this concept of one water, where the water that we drink is the water that is in the environment and we need to steward it. But this conversation isn't just about water. It's about many of the aspects of landscaping that are overlooked by gardeners that actually could conceivably heal the planet. So here we go. I think the number one topic that I want to talk about today is desertification. Now, actually, it's probably not this. It's not a yummy topic. It's more like this. It's desertification. Desertification is something that is occurring in Mediterranean climates, high steppe climates, plains areas, and semi-arid areas. And you can see from this graph that a huge portion of North America is actually under threat or vulnerable to desertification. What is that? Well, desertification is essentially the creation of a man-made desert. And it's a result of practices that degrade the soil and actually kill the soil. And this death of soil happens when the structure is destroyed, and we'll talk a lot about how you maintain structure, create structure in soil. It's also a result of removing plants from a system, so not just deforestation, but actually not planting landscape. And then the third thing that really contributes to desertification is not holding rainwater on a site and rather allowing it to slough off and be wasted. So these three practices rather contribute to this creation of a man-made desert. And this is a very, very serious thing that is happening because soil is a critical resource for us as human beings. And we really need to figure out how do we restore it and how do we bring life back to these places that are at risk. And the reason that we're particularly focused on this is that when soils become desertified, they actually, the area becomes not only drier, but it actually contributes to changes in the weather. So a very, very dry area becomes a lot hotter. There's a kind of feedback loop on that creates extended drought periods because now the soil becomes very, very dried out. Then that heat actually has an impact on the oceans, which are heating up. And as a result of that, they're putting more water vapor into the atmosphere. And so the storms that we get are incredibly volatile, filled with rain. And so the cycle is a drought period, and then it's followed by deluge. And when that deluge comes, and we're thinking, oh, we're saved, it's actually just the opposite, because the water is coming so fast and the soil is so degraded that it can't actually absorb that water. So we end up having horrible flooding. And even though it is raining, it's not actually restoring the soil. So this terrible feedback loop of drought and deluge is something that desertification magnifies. And so that's why we want to kind of focus in on it to see, are there things that we can do in the landscape, and will they have impact perhaps on weather and on climate down the line? And I think one of the things that I like to talk about is the fact that we as gardeners and landscapers, or landscape professionals rather, actually kind of have a blind spot to our role in all of this. And blind spots, professional blind spots, are basically described as areas where your expertise allows you to kind of overlook the value that you have in a situation, and you often don't see, really obvious things that could be right in front of you because, you're either distracted with something else, or you just, literally because of your expertise, don't see it as an issue that is something that you would be dealing with. And this is the essence of the talk, I think, that landscape professionals and gardeners have kind of had a professional blind spot to this incredible role that they can play in regenerating soil and regenerating landscapes. So I want to take us back to the principle that all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. If that's the case, then gardeners are the superheroes that can solve those problems. So we have to start to see things differently. We have to begin to imagine ourselves in a role of dealing with landscapes and having impact. One of the things that I want us to agree on, like right up front, is that monoculture, especially turfgrass, is not a garden. That when we plant and when we create landscapes that have this monoculture and lack biodiversity and don't do all the regenerative practices that we're going to talk about, we're actually contributing to the problem rather than becoming part of the solution. And so I don't even want to call a turf-covered landscape a garden. Unless, of course, you have clover in your garden and you're maintaining it naturally and you're aerating it and it's functioning as a place of biodiversity. Okay, then call it a garden. And one of the things that I want us to think about is that the ideas that I'm going to be presenting today really aren't about sacrifice. So often when we talk about doing something different from the norm or from the way it's been done for many, many years, it kind of feels like we're giving something up in order to do that. Well, in reality, we're not giving anything up. We're gaining a lot by undertaking this effort of regenerating landscapes. And so I want us to really reframe our own way of thinking about this and understand that we're not talking about sacrificing here. We're talking about changing. And the biggest change happens right here. It's between our ears. It's our own minds, really seeing that we have a role to play, that we understand how our expertise can be brought into a landscape, and we know how to actually talk about it so that others can participate in this effort that we're going to undertake. So the change starts here, and that's the biggest change that we have to begin to imagine. So get ready. I'm going to flip a few of the things that you think about landscape right on their head. And that starts with talking about the watershed approach to landscaping. I get a lot of pushback on this word watershed because, of course it's not actually a shed on water. But when you say the word watershed, a lot of people think of, the big open spaces with the trees and the mountains and the lakes. And what does that have to do with landscaping? Well, the definition of watershed is an area of land where all the water that falls on it drains to the same place. So when we use that as our definition of a watershed, we could actually apply it to any property, to every single piece of land. In fact, that definition could be applied to a rooftop because it's just an area of land where all the water that falls on it drains to the same place. So the idea of the watershed approach is essentially a model. It's a way for us to kind of get our hands around or our mind around identifying and evaluating a particular area, and then coming up with practices to regenerate that landscape. And so this watershed approach is really more of a model than anything else. But it does have principles, and it does have a sort of a basic underlying understanding of what a healthy, balanced watershed is. And the good news is that there are many, many watershed managers throughout the world and throughout our Pacific region who understand that there are a set of principles that you apply to a watershed on a large scale in order to keep it in balance or bring it back to balance. And so I just want to take a second to make sure that we all understand what some of those principles are. So in the watershed approach, we have water that comes from the sky. And something I want to mention right up front is that water is in constant motion. There's no such thing as actually still water. It's being worked on by gravity and capillary action and evaporation. All kinds of stuff are working on water at all times. So it's in constant movement. When the water comes from the sky, it's intercepted by plants and by soil. And that means it's like grabbed up into those plants and soil. And gravity begins to work on that water, pulling it down through the soil profile. It'll infiltrate into the root zone of the plant, and then depending on the circumstances, it may actually be pulled by gravity down past the root zone of the plant, infiltrating and percolating into the soil to restore groundwater if that's appropriate, or capillary action begins to work on the water and pull it through the soil to, I hate when that happens, sorry. Pulling it through the soil so that it moves toward a local waterway. So it actually moves through the soil to a creek or a stream or a river or ultimately the ocean. And the key really is that the water is passing through this giant system of plants and soil before it reaches the water. And that the plants and the soil are holding a lot of that water within the root zone of the system. And that's kind of a key thing, not just for a water conservation message, but also because water that passes through a system of plants and soil is clean before it enters the water source, table or the streams and creeks. And so this is a very important water quality issue. Anyway, once the water has gone into the system and the sun comes back out, water is now transferred by plants from the soil up into the atmosphere as water vapor. And this process begins again. Clouds are formed, water comes back down through the system, sun comes out, water up into the sky as water vapor. And this is how a healthy, balanced watershed works. So let's take a look at a landscape and see how we could maybe make it perform in that way. It starts with thinking about every single property as though it's a mini watershed. And that means identifying the top of the watershed, which is probably the roof, and the bottom of the watershed, which is where the water is running off the property and going into a storm drain street or whatever. Everything that happens between the top of the watershed and the bottom of the watershed is your responsibility. You have impact on that mini watershed. And so you can choose degrading practices like the ones that you see in this picture, or you can choose to use regenerative practices. And the regenerative practices of the watershed approach are really simple. There are 4 key principles. The first one is that we grow healthy living soil. We create a sponge in the ground that can manage water. The second principle is that we passively capture rainwater. So we use rainwater as a resource for the landscape. The third principle is that we select climate appropriate, preferably local native plants, because they know how to behave in this particular place. And then the fourth principle is that we use highly efficient irrigation, but only when necessary. And so that means if the soil sponge and the selection of plants and the capturing of rainwater is not sufficient water for our landscape, we utilize irrigation, but we make sure that the equipment is in top order, that it's been designed properly, and maybe even most importantly, that it's managed properly. So that's highly efficient irrigation. Those are the 4 principles of the watershed approach and the effort to regenerate landscapes into health. So let's start with soil. The key technology of the watershed approach is living soil. And I want you to look at this picture. Tell me, how does this soil look like a sponge? If you say, well, it's got holes, you're right. That's exactly how it looks like a sponge. And you can also kind of see that it's sort of dark, it's held together by lots of roots. This is soil that has good structure, and we're going to talk a little bit more about structure in a bit. But it looks like a sponge because it has a lot of places for oxygen, and it kind of is all held together. Plus, it's supporting wildlife right there in the middle of the screen. And I think it's important for us to start to make a distinction between dirt and living soil. Now, dirt is kind of the thing that we learned about in soils class, however many years ago when we were in horticulture training. We learned about the types of soil, sand, silt, or clay, and the combination thereof. And a typical discussion about soil is really that it's kind of a medium that we're putting plants into, and it's like a pass-through, if you will, for the plants. It's composed of minerals and particles of rock and so forth, and some organic matter is in the soil, and generally the more organic matter, the better. And then there's also pore space, so there's room for oxygen and water. And recently, and when I say that, I mean really over the last 10 or 15 years, we've come to recognize that actually one of the most important elements of soil is that those pore spaces are occupied by creatures. They're occupied by microorganisms that play a critical role in managing the way that the soil behaves. And so when we talk about soil as living soil, we're talking about the oxygen, the water, and the life in the soil, as well as the parent material. Because the parent material, the soil type, is something that's immutable. You cannot change that. If you have sand, you have sand. If you have clay, you have clay soil. But what we're concerned about is, do you have a brick or do you have a sponge? And you can have a brick with sand, silt, or clay, and you can have a sponge with clay, silt, or sand. So structure is really where we're going with all of this. And I think this is a great image to illustrate structure to people who don't really get what I'm talking about. So in this picture, we have samples of soil that have been taken from 2 areas. The two people in the back of the picture, they have here, these two people, they have a soil sample that's from the same field, but it's from different places within the field. And the people here in the front, they have a soil sample that's from the same place, the same garden, but from different places in the garden. And what you can see in the picture is that the soil sample that was taken from a place that was heavily compacted because it was driven over by a tractor, and it kind of compressed all the oxygen and water out of that soil, basically killing the life. It created a brick. And that soil sample is the one that you see here in the very first container, because when that soil sample was put into the water, it fell apart right away. It wasn't able to stick together. Yet, a sample taken from the very same field, but from an area that is not compacted, that is a sponge, is holding together when you put it into water. So the soil type in these two situations is exactly the same, but the soil structure is completely different. One is a brick, one is a sponge. And the same applies to the two people in the front picture. In fact, that middle woman here, her soil sample has completely disappeared. It's just completely dissolved in the water. Whereas the very same soil type in this person's hand has a completely clean container of water. It has not fallen apart. It's holding together. And that's because it has oxygen, water, and life. It has great soil structure. So this is really what we are focusing on, creating really good soil structure. And I want to talk about how we do that. So take a second and think about your very favorite plant. I mean, mine is the oak tree that you see here, but yours is whatever. So kind of mental image of that plant and think about it. So nice. Okay. How many of you thought about the roots in that mental image? I give this talk often, and I find that, in a room full of 100 people, 2 or 3 will raise their hands. Most of us aren't really trained in our mental image of plants to be thinking about the root structure of those plants. And yet, most of the energy that the plant is exerting is happening in the root zone. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not making a claim that 80% of the mass of the plant is happening in the soil. I'm not actually sure how much of the mass of a plant is in the soil. What I'm talking about is the energy of the plant. What is the plant concentrating on? I mean, if you can really say concentrating, which actually some people do make that case. But what is the plant exerting energy on? I mean, above ground, we have photosynthesis. We have reproduction. Those are 2 pretty big, functions. But in the soil, we have everything else, and we have the life force, really, of this plant. What's happening here is that the plant is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's using photosynthesis, that nuclear power, to kind of drive this process of removing the carbon from the atmosphere. And then it's converting that carbon into a bunch of different new structures, new carbon-based chains. And some of it gets used to build its body and to build its reproduction, fruits and flowers. And all of that is very, very important. But then a lot of this carbon is taken and converted into chains that are carbohydrates and fats and enzymes and all kinds of stuff. And that is exuded out through the roots of the plant into the soil in order to attract mutualists, creatures that will perform functions for the plant and create an environment that is healthy for the plant. And I think this is really important for us to understand, that when we think about a plant feeding itself, it's to build its body. But actually, the plant is feeding itself by feeding a huge soil party of microbes at its root zone. Billions and billions of creatures, microscopic creatures, are living in the root zone of the plant, and they're performing functions for the plant, creating nutrient, bringing water, creating immune system elements, creating nutrient. Did I say that already? Anyway, doing a lot of stuff for this plant. And what they're essentially doing is they're accepting food from the plant as an incentive to give back these nutrients and so forth. And so this soil party is really what is driving the life force of this plant. And the bigger the root system, the bigger the soil party. And something really super cool about this is that this soil party is just trading in carbon, and it's taking that, the plant has taken the carbon from the atmosphere, transferred it, or a portion of it, to the soil party, and then the soil party is trading it and transferring it even to other parts of the soil. So this is like a giant carbon sequestration thing going on in addition to the plant taking care of itself. So plants really are the first carbon farmers. They're in control of their environment. They know what they need, when they need it, and they can create the little carbon chains to attract the creatures that will provide what they need when they need it. So now we can begin to think about this living soil, filled with microbes and filled with plant roots. And what it's really doing is it's creating a structure in the soil that, as we say, is a sponge. It's like a carbon-based sponge, and it's enormous. It's a huge multiple of the biomass of the plant itself in carbon. And what's cool about this is carbon is hydrophilic, meaning it likes water. So now what we're creating is a physical structure within the soil that can hold on to water. This is super critical in a dry climate, but it's also super critical in a wet climate, because how does a sponge behave? When you put water into a dry sponge, it fills up with that water, it takes it in, and it holds on to it. If you wring out that sponge of all the water that you can see, is it bone dry? No, it's not, because it's holding on to water in that sponge. If you fill up the sponge completely and every pore space is filled with water, does the water just start gushing out of the sponge? No, the sponge regulates the water and it starts to drip out of that sponge. So even in a wet climate, having a soil sponge is critical, because you want to manage the process of water into the soil and the process of water out of the soil. Okay, if you create this giant sponge of oxygen, water, and life, what water do you put into it? Well, the free water from the sky, the abundant water, the water that we get in the natural environment, is the rain. So let's look to the rain as our first resource for water in the landscape. And it really is an incredible resource. 1 inch of water, or 1 inch of rain, on 1,000 square foot hard surface, like a roof, generates 600 gallons of water. Now, it's actually a little more than 600 gallons, but we'll use that because it's easy. It's easy for calculation. So 1 inch of water on 1,000 square foot roof generates 600 gallons of water. I mean, if you live in a place that gets even just 10 inches of water a year, that's 6,000 gallons of water. It's incredible. And I think what's really even cooler than the fact that, hard surfaces will generate water is that you don't need a lot of soil area in order to take that water in. You only need 150 square feet, 6 inches deep, in order to hold 600 gallons of water. So we're not talking about, giant pits and all kinds of crazy landforming and drainage. We're talking about divots. We're talking about small depressions that can hold onto water. And this 1 inch is really kind of an important number because it represents the most polluted water after a period. So if you live in a climate that is a Mediterranean or steppe climate where you have extended dry periods and the rain is infrequent, or you have dry periods between rainstorms, all kinds of pollutants build up in your little environment, in your little watershed. And if you allow that water, that polluted water, like, stuff on your roof and so forth, if you allow that to go into your landscape, it just becomes a food source for the plants and for the microbes. But if that pollution is allowed to go out to the street, and everybody's pollution goes out to the street, it runs into waterways and it ends up polluting the waterways. Because remember, the only way we can keep water clean in our watershed is by putting water through a system of plants and soil before it gets to the waterway. So this 1 inch is kind of a critical number because it's called the first flush, and it's the most polluted water that is a real resource for your landscape, but if allowed to run off, could be a real terror in the environment. And in terms of holding on to rainwater, rain barrels are great, but if you look at this rain barrel, it's a 55-gallon rain barrel. We need, 10 of them, 11 of them in order to capture just that 1 inch of rain. Living soil is a better and more profound cistern or barrel than any structure ever could be. So creating living soil really is the secret. The living soil cistern maybe is what we should start calling it. On the right-hand side, you can see this is a 200-gallon cistern, and it's used to water these fruit trees along the side of the house, and that's great. I'm not saying that having cisterns is not a good thing. Of course, it's a great thing. But what I am saying is, let's think about the soil first as our storage, and then the cistern is like the backup to the soil water. So rain barrels and cisterns actually become a way to manage water, to slow it down, to store it for that extra little bit. But we're going to concentrate on putting the water into the soil in what's called passive capture of rainwater. And so we need to start to think about, how does our landscape look, and how does water move in the property, and try to develop a plan that takes advantage of the natural systems that are on our property, or on our Mini-Watershed. In this particular case, the reason that you have such a giant creek here is because this is a new construction home, and when I first took a look at it, it was just grass with these, giant drains along the side of the house. And the property owner said, why do I have such giant drains here? And little research explains that, wow, the entire neighborhood is draining into this side yard. And so all the uphill neighbors, all the water is running off of their properties, and it's ending up here in this property. And so when it rains, these big pipes underground and the drains in the lawn were designed to move that water as quickly as possible off the site. And after a little consultation with the homeowner, we decided, hey, maybe it would be really cool to see that water when it is in the environment and celebrate it instead of trying to hide it this way. And so that's how we built this creek, what's called a dry creek bed, or a swale, and we'll talk about those in a second. But that's how we came to build this, and build it so large, because it needs the capacity to take all this water. And it still has some drains in it so that it doesn't overflow or back up against the house, but it allows us to start to collect some amount of that water coming from all these other properties and put it into our landscape. And you can see we've planted a bunch of trees here, and those trees are super happy to have all that water in the wintertime. So it can look like anything. It can be very, very naturalistic. or it can be a little bit more manicured, but it just needs to be a simple swale to hold on to this rainwater. And so I want to kind of break down the couple of elements in this picture. You can see that the downspout in the picture here is putting the water actually onto the driveway, and the driveway is sloped toward the swale in the foreground. So the water comes down the downspout and it flows across the driveway into the swale, where it's then spread out over a pretty big area and allowed to sink into the ground. The soil that was taken out of the swale was used to create these kind of bermed higher structures here between the sidewalk and the swale, and also between the swale and the barn. And the plants that love to be in dry conditions, kind of up a little higher, good drainage, are planted up on that berm. Now, they will access the water that's come into the swale, but, kind of at a distance. They're letting, the capillary action of the water under the ground provide them with water in the winter when it comes. But the plants that are in the swale, those are ones that love to have their feet wet in the winter. And so they're totally comfortable even being submerged in water. And they're down in the bottom of the swale. And so this design of having these depressions, and very small depressions, I mean, if you look at the rocks in this picture, you can see we're not talking about giant rocks, 24-inch rocks. We're talking, about 6 to 10 inches of depression here. And so that little depression will fill up with water when it comes from the sky, and then it will sink into the healthy soil. These plants will just suck it up and love it. And so it really doesn't matter what it looks like. What matters is how it functions. And this is a beautiful picture, I think. This is a hillside area where these pools are actually taking water and then connected to each other, dropping the water through these different pools, so you can actually, see the distinct pools when the water's in there. And again, the rainwater is not in this system for even 2 days. It's in the system for a couple of hours, because that soil sponge with all those plants and all that mulch and all that good stuff, that's just sucking it up and holding on to the water. So what happens when we have water in the root zone? We've got really great soil structure. We've got lots of root. We've got water now, rainwater that's gone into that soil structure. What happens to it? And I just want to make sure that that I identify this term called green water. Green water is a term that we landscape professionals haven't gotten used to using yet, but I think we will over the next decade or so. Green water is water that's in the system of plants. So it's in the root zone, it's in the plants itself, and it's compared to blue water. Blue water is water that you can see in a creek or in a water table or in a river or in the ocean. That's blue water. But green water is water in the living system of the plants. And so when we talk about water in a landscape, like, landscape water, we're talking about green water. So what happens to it when it's in the soil sponge? Well, let's do a little thought process here. Why don't we dress like this every day? What do you think? I mean, of course, it's because we have an atmosphere here on this beautiful planet. And so what is the most abundant atmospheric gas? Give you a second, because some of you are going to say, oh, it's oxygen, oh, it's nitrogen. But actually, it's water vapor. That's the most abundant atmospheric gas. So what makes water vapor? Well, we've said so already. These guys, trees, plants, plankton, that's what makes water vapor. And so really, the atmosphere has been largely constructed by plants and soil microbes. And the process by which plants transfer water from their root zone, from this, this green water that's in the soil, the process by which they transfer that water up into the atmosphere as water vapor is called evapotranspiration. And it's comprised really of two things: evaporation of the water from the soil, and transpiration, which is kind of like a plant sweat of the water from the plants. I think that evapotranspiration is an overlooked water source, because this water is managed by the plants. And we could actually calculate how much water the plants are removing from soil and putting back up into the atmosphere. Now, we can also take a look at the timing of when plants are moving water more rapidly or more slowly from the soil to the atmosphere. And it turns out that in our Mediterranean and dry climates especially, or summer dry climates especially, we find that our local native plants are actually evapotranspiring less, because they have adaptations. They're not growing, they're not putting on, or they're not utilizing as much water in the summertime. They're kind of shutting down. And so as a result, they are evapotranspiring much more aggressively in the spring and in the fall. But then in the summertime, they're kind of shutting down. So this is an interesting thing from a water conservation perspective, because not only are our Mediterranean and local native plants and climate appropriate plants in our region requiring less water than really thirsty plants like lawn and other high water, high evapotranspiration plants. So not only do they require less water, but they also require that water in times other than the heart of the summer. So these are things for us to begin to consider when we're selecting plants. We want to have plants that aren't thirsty in the summertime, and when they do get thirsty in the fall and coming into the winter, when they're growing, blooming, doing their thing, we're putting water in from the sky instead of having to irrigate them in the heart of the summertime. So this concept of evapotranspiration is really important for us in terms of selecting our plants. It's also important for us in terms of grouping our plants in the landscape. We want to begin to think from like a design point of view about how do we keep plants that are low water use or very low water use or moderate water use. How do we keep them grouped together so we could irrigate them effectively? And just to be clear, when I say moderate water use or low or very low, what I'm essentially doing is I'm comparing this evapotranspiration rate of those plants to a really thirsty plant like lawn. If lawn is evapotranspiring 50 inches of water, and a lot of that happening in the deep part of the summer, that's a thirsty plant. But we can select plants that are adapted to our climate that only evapotranspire half of the water that lawn might require, and those would be moderates. Or even plants that are super adapted to they're like adapted to the rainy season and the summer dry periods, and they only need maybe 5 or 10 inches of water a year, 10%, 5% of the water that a lawn would need. So this concept of evapotranspiration is actually a really critical one for plant selection and for knowing that you are selecting those local native and climate appropriate plants. So another reason that we select these local native plants is because they are adapted to not just the weather patterns and the climate of our place, but they're also adapted to the soils. And they like to work together. And so they are actually growing huge root structures when they're getting the right amount of water in the right time of year. Those root structures are growing together. There's a symbiotic relationship under the ground, and they're creating these ginormous green water zones. They're sequestering huge quantities of carbon. They're growing giant soil parties around their roots. And as a result, the green water sponges are really big. And this is why in a summer dry place, in a natural area, the plants can survive, and not just survive, but thrive through a dry time. It's because they have these huge resources that they've created in the green water soil sponge of their environments. So it's another reason for us to select the local native plants. And a third reason to select them is because we are suffering from a huge loss in biodiversity, not just species biodiversity in the plant world, but also all of the creatures that are dependent upon those plants. You know, they are at huge risk for loss in our region. And so when we plant those local native plants, we're giving a lifeline to all of the invertebrates, all of the insects and the tiny creatures, the amphibians, you know, the little mammals. We're giving a lifeline to the birds that rely on the insects and the other creatures that rely on the insects and the small mammals. Really, planting local native plants, creating biodiversity in our landscapes, not just underground biodiversity, but above ground biodiversity is perhaps the greatest mission that is facing us right now. And as superhero gardeners, we know, hey, we can do that. We can we can protect biodiversity and actually enhance it through our landscapes. And if that isn't enough, which, you know, a lot, let's add another layer to it. When we have these local native plants with these giant green water zones that are supporting biodiversity of all kinds in our region, we are also improving stream flow and water quality, because those giant sponges are also giant filters. And any water that's passing through those sponges is getting clean before it goes to the water table or before it moves into the local waterway and ultimately to the ocean. So we can start to think about landscapes instead of being, you know, water sucks, which is pretty much how landscapes have been characterized over the last 100 years. Maybe we should start to think of them as water suppliers instead. This evapotranspiration that they provide to us is a critical water supply. And this green water that they hold in the soil is a critical water supply because it enhances the performance of our local waterways and groundwater. Now, it is possible that even when we do the right thing with having the soil and the right plants and we capture the rainwater from the sky, it is possible that our landscapes will require some amount of supplemental irrigation. You know, maybe it's just during an establishment period, or maybe it's a backup for those really dry winters. But when we add an irrigation system into the mix, we want to make sure that it is as efficient as possible, that the equipment is well designed, or the installation of the equipment is well designed, it is installed properly, and that we are managing it properly. We know how the plant-soil water relationship is working so that we can put water into the landscape through irrigation only when it's absolutely necessary. One of the first lines of defense for creating a more efficient irrigation system is to make sure that you have irrigation control that is smart. In other words, it's weather-based. So it monitors the weather and it monitors evapotranspiration. So it's measuring how much water is coming out of the soil and the plants before it schedules putting water back into the soil and the plants. And so this smart weather-based irrigation control actually helps a lot in terms of managing a landscape that, you know, you might not be out there turning it on or turning it off at the right times. The irrigation controller has sort of built into it algorithms that help to hone in on a really efficient cycle. And the way that you can tell whether it's a good smart irrigation controller is look for the WaterSense label. That is a label that demonstrates that these products are saving at least 20% water over a typical non-WaterSense labeled product, and they have been vetted by a process, and they're rising to a standard. So look for that WaterSense label, not just for weather-based irrigation control, but for any kind of equipment that you're using in your landscape irrigation system. Keep your eye out for WaterSense. And in fact, for professionals too, who are managing water, look for people who are certified WaterSense professionals. So a lot of talk. Let's take a look at what these landscapes are like. The examples that you're about to see are landscapes from all over the Pacific horticulture region. And what I love about them is that they all look completely different. They have elements that are the same, but they are very appropriate for the place where they are. And yet they all function exactly the same. They all have soil sponge, hold on to rainwater, climate appropriate plants, and very little irrigation or highly efficient irrigation if it's present. So take a look at some of these. I mean, to me, they are really beautiful because they reflect the sense of place. And I know, because I have sort of like now a new way of looking at landscapes, I know that they're performing in a beautiful way as well. And you can see that some of these landscapes are at single-family residences, and some of them are at commercial places that get a lot of foot traffic, but they all perform the same way. They could be at schools, or they could be in private retreats in the backyard. In north, up in Oregon, Washington, or Southern California. They're all beautiful, and they're all functioning in the way of a healthy, balanced watershed. I like this landscape, and I want to point out a couple of things. The first is that there are 3 water capture areas in this picture. 2 of them you can't see at all. There's one, you can see because the plants are super happy. So one of the catchment areas is right here. It's about 150 square feet. And then another catchment area is over here. But it's a mulch-filled depression. So, you really can't see it, and the plants all fill in. The one that you can see here is this curb cut. And curb cuts aren't appropriate in every single property, and you have to check with your municipality to make sure they're okay. But in this particular place, they were okay. I want to show you how it looks when it rains. This is what happens. The water is coming down the gutter here, and it goes through the curb and into this basin that is collecting the water for the benefit of the tree. This very simple approach, applying the watershed approach to landscaping to a parkway area with the permission of the municipality, I might add. This is something that is really interesting because we're taking water out, not just from our property and dealing with it. That's what those 2 depressions on the main landscape are doing. This depression is taking water out of the street. And so this is taking it from the collective. I think it's kind of a cool concept. Here's a landscape that's in a public area, and it has no irrigation. And I will tell you that this is a picture that was taken at the end of September after a very dry summer. And I love it because it is in Southern California. But what I love about it is you would expect that in Southern California in the end of September with no irrigation at a public site where you know it's getting no attention whatsoever, that this would be a really dry brown place. And it's not. It's really green. And what I love is that those irises, you know, the foliage is still green on them. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Okay, I want to take a few minutes to walk you through a case study of how we convert a landscape, a single family residence, from a turf covered, very high water use landscape where the downspouts from the roof were taking water right out to the street. How do we convert that into a watershed-wise landscape? And in this particular property, a couple things of note. As I said, the downspout is collecting water and putting it right out into the street. But what's really important here is that the river is right across the street. So any pollutants that were on the roof are kind of going straight out to the, to the river. So the property owner decided that he wanted to remove the lawn by doing something called sheet mulching. And sheet mulching is essentially the layering of paper or cardboard, compost, and mulch, and watering the whole thing. It's basically like creating a compost pile in your front yard, essentially. And it's allowing the microbial action in all of that good organic matter break down the grass and also turn the soil into a sponge. And so this process is kind of this layering process, and it uses water to wake up the microbes that are on all of this organic matter to get eating. And so when we showed up to look at this, the homeowner had done the sheet mulching about a month prior. But there's something wrong with it, because when we explored it, we saw that, yeah, the grass is brown, so it's clearly not getting any sunlight. That's a good thing. It's gone brown, but we can still read the paper, the newspaper. Something's wrong, and that something is there wasn't enough water used when this process was done. You need to use water. You need to make sure that that water is waking everything up, all those microbes, to get them to start to eat up the organic matter, and also to eat up the lawn, which is organic matter, of course. But anyway, another thing that you can see in this picture that I think is interesting is this downspout here on the left-hand side is connected directly to the street. But what we want to do is cut it off and redirect it into the landscape. And so the hose that you see running down the middle of the landscape is the path that we want the water to take once it is out of that pipe going out to the street. And then finally, I want to point out something here, and that is the big truck on the neighbor's lawn. We have nothing to do with that. But do you think the lawn underneath there is compacted? So the plan is that we are going to redirect this downspout into the landscape, and we're going to slow down the water, spread it out in the landscape, and sink it into the soil. The homeowner really loved local native plants, and so he went about starting to raise them from seed. And so he propagated his own native plants and placed them on a plan, properly spaced, so that he could reduce the amount of pruning and maintenance that he had to do, and making sure he had plenty of room for those huge shrubs that he was selecting, even though they were going to be really teeny tiny when he planted them. So after about 4 months, the first pictures that you saw of the sheet mulching was in July, and now it's November. We came back and raked away the very top layer of the mulch, and what do we find underneath? Is there grass there? Is there newspaper? No. It's all been decomposed. It's all been turned into a giant, yummy, spongy soil. Just absolutely beautiful, easy to work. This is a clay area, and yet here we are digging away. And what we're doing now is we're going to contour the soil in order to redirect the downspout into the landscape. And you can see here in this picture that there are actually two depressions now. The depression on the left has a berm between the building and the depression, and then there's sort of a giant berm in the middle, and then another small depression on the other side, and a little berm before the sidewalk. And what we ended up calculating was that the roof area was the same size as the landscape area. So we needed a little extra room to slow that water down and spread it out. And so we made these two swales and connected it so that the water could kind of move through the landscape a little bit better than just straight down the middle. And you'll notice here that what we're doing is we're adding biology to the soil. So we're adding some bacteria actually in the form of compost because we disturbed the soil when we did all this digging and contouring. And so we really disturbed the soil party when we did that. Now we want to get the soil party going again. So we put in a little bit more compost to kind of inoculate the whole thing and get everything moving again. And here's a picture of what the landscape looked like right after we were done. So we had contoured and we planted those plants, and then we came back with another 3 to 4 inches of mulch to cover everything up. And you can see that the plants are really tiny. They're spaced far apart because we know that they're going to grow. And the downspout is redirected into this area. The homeowner liked rock, so these depressions are filled with rock, but they're not very deep. They're 10 inches deep or so. And then this rock is spread out kind of artfully throughout, but I want to emphasize that you don't have to use rock when you do one of these passive capture systems. In fact, it's almost easier to just use mulch and plants. So don't feel like you have to go out and spend lots of money or, acquire giant boulders, or fill everything up with rock. No, you don't. I mean, if you like that, that's cool. But if you don't, that's okay as well. Anyway, this person did like it. And so there are some rock in the landscape. Now, just a month later, it rained, and boy, did it rain. I mean, it rained unusually hard and long for this region. So it's December, we got 4 inches of rain in one storm, really unusual. And in the landscape, we captured about 1,600 gallons of water. So I want you just to look at this picture for a second. So first of all, you can see that now you can really see the way that the basins are created. And you can see that there's sort of deeper areas and more shallow areas, but that the water is spreading out throughout, and it's not running off the property. It's staying on the property. That's the first thing, and that's 4 inches of rain from the sky. The second thing that I think is really interesting about this is that that water did not stay visible in this system for very long. It was not there for 2 days. It was not there for 1 day. It disappeared within a matter of hours. And why is that? Well, that soil has been turned into a sponge. It has a lot of mulch in it as well. And so it just sucked up all that water. So I want you to think about one more thing beside all of that. If the roof area is the same size as the landscape area, and got 4 inches of rain from the sky, and so of course that rain fell on landscape, how much water in inches did this landscape actually receive? Think about it for 1 second. Well, it received the 4 inches from the sky on the landscape, but it also received 4 inches that had been gathered on the roof. So the water you're seeing in these depressions is an additional 4 inches of rain. So in this rainstorm, this landscape got 8 inches of water, held on to all of it. And then there was a dry spell in between December and the next rainstorm. And this picture is taken, by lying on my stomach to try to show, the shape of the landscape, so you can really see, you know, how this works. And up there is this berm area where plants that like their feet dry are located, and then there are these depressions where plants that like their feet wet are located. And you can also see that there's kind of a big rock in the foreground, and that rock is slowing down the water, because when it comes down that downspout, it's coming really fast, and so that rock is kind of like breaking the speed of the water coming out and spreading it out into this little basin here in the front, so it can stays in the landscape instead of running off. So in February we got another rainstorm, and you can see it build up again. It's like a 3.5-inch rainstorm, another very large rainstorm. And in this particular year, we didn't get a lot of other rain. These two big rainstorms were kind of it for the season. So if we look at how this landscape performed and compare it, let's say, to the neighbor's landscape received 7.5 inches over the entire season, because that's what came from the sky onto the landscape. But because we're capturing rainwater from the roof, and the roof is about the same size as our landscape, our garden actually got 15 inches of water. So in a place where a 7.5-inch year is a dry winter, our landscape got average rainfall of 15 inches. So this is really the key to why we want to start to think about using this passive capture, especially in dry climates or in summer dry climates. Because when we have dry winters, we are actually getting more water in these landscapes. We're getting sufficient water in these landscapes to allow them to make it through the summertime without requiring additional irrigation. And you can see here that in April, everything is fine. No irrigation is needed. Things are growing, things are blooming, the landscape is really getting going. And by August, things are really getting quite large. I mean, even though they're still not completely established, there's a lot happening here, and very little watering occurred. It was mostly hand watering for, you know, putting in some new plants and changing things out and so forth. But it's not irrigation being run during the summertime. And here it is 2 years later. No significant irrigation. You can't even see the depression anymore. It's completely planted over. It's a completely different experience in this landscape. And when you compare it to the landscape next door that's still on, you realize that it's different, and on so many levels. It's a change, you know, just in so many ways. And wouldn't you say that it's not a sacrifice, that it's actually a change for good? So one of the cool things that I want to bring to your attention is that last year in March, the United Nations Water Commission put out a really interesting research document that says nature-based solutions are the way to go for improving groundwater and recharging soil moisture. In other words, fighting desertification. And this idea of nature-based solution, well, guess what? That's a fancy word for landscape and garden. So here it is, internationally, worldwide, knowing that desertification is a huge issue that we're going to be facing as humans. The UN is saying, hey, everybody, landscapes are the solution that we need to pursue. And I want to take it just one step further and start to think a little bit about the implications of restoring these landscapes everywhere that we, you know, everywhere, not just in dry climates, but everywhere on the face of the earth. When we are restoring the terrestrial systems, these landscape systems, we're actually having a direct impact on weather and climate. And this kind of goes back to the very beginning of the talk, where I was talking about drought being followed by deluge, and how the fact that soils had become desertified led to a lot of heat, which actually heated up the ocean and all that sort of thing. And so I'm kind of circling back to that now to say, now that we understand that we can build landscapes with healthy soil and that hold on to rainwater in these giant root zone systems, and we don't have to use irrigation water that we're pumping out of the ground or bringing from some other person's watershed, that, you know, we can have these healthy, balanced, regenerative systems that have all these other multiple benefits, that when we look at it in the context of what's going on in weather and climate, it begins to become really compelling, especially in urban areas and suburban areas. And this is because if we just think about it, when every day, you know, every minute that the sun is out, there is a huge amount of radiation and energy being sent down onto the planet. And, you know, it's 2 nuclear power plants worth for every 4 square miles. I mean, it's a giant amount of energy. And that energy has to go somewhere. So it's either going to be absorbed by systems like the ocean, or the plankton in the ocean, or plants, or soil. So either that energy is going to be absorbed by all that, or it's going to be reflected back. And when it's reflected back, it has an amplification effect. So not that energy begins to actually become almost unmanageable because it's within, you know, our atmosphere. And so I want to think about, in settings where we have a lot of development, like an urban setting where we've basically made hardscape surfaces, you know, roofs and driveways and sidewalks and roadways, and we've gotten rid of landscape area, and the landscape area that we have is not promoting giant root zones and passive rainwater capture. When we have a paradigm like that, which is in fact the paradigm we have in most of our urban and suburban settings, we are actually setting off a feedback loop that is very, very dangerous. This is the feedback loop that is putting more energy, like reflecting energy off of the surfaces of our environment, and it's heating up the ocean. It's what's creating these very water vapor filled hot systems off of the ocean, and it's also creating kind of a heat island effect over our cities and over our over the urban areas where there isn't a lot of plant material. And so this is kind of a scary scenario, because what we have happening is this umbrella of heat actually keeps moisture away from our urban area, unless it's coming in these violent storms. And even then, sometimes those storms are pushed away from inland areas. It's pushed away from urban areas. And the result is that the rainfall ends up on coastal areas, on places that are a lot more vulnerable, where oceans interface with the land. And this is the kind of weather pattern that is underlying, or maybe is actually an effect, a result of rather, desertification and the heat island effect created around cities. And the answer to sort of breaking this cycle is to go back to a pre-development idea of how we handle our landscapes and say, you know, we really want to green up as much as we possibly can. We want to make sure that we have plant material everywhere that we possibly can, because that plant material is evapotranspiring and it's managing soil water. And so that plant material is sort of creating this small water cycle that brings a gentle rain, a more predictable precipitation over landscape, over land areas, and it's cooling down the environment so that the oceans can cool down and not have that same amount of horrible water vapor in the atmosphere that creates these really violent and really unpredictable storms that is essentially taking the energy from the sun and allowing plants to manage it. And isn't that what plants do anyway, right? They don't only manage the soil environment with their carbon making, carbon string making, but they also manage the moisture in the air, and they absorb a huge amount of energy from the sun in order to make that all happen. There's something kind of profound about this idea of regenerating a landscape so that plants can do their job, so that the terrestrial systems that this earth has relied on for millennia can work in the favor of humans instead of against it. And so this is why we advocate the watershed approach to landscaping. It's simple. It's living soil, selecting climate appropriate plants, holding on to rainwater on our landscapes instead of allowing it to go away. And this is essential, really, for the entire planet, certainly for our dry region, but for all of humanity. And it turns landscape professionals, it turns gardeners, it turns the people with soil on their hands into the real superheroes of our lifetime. We are the ones who can make the difference here. We're the ones who can bring the expertise and the hands on the land to heal her. This talk was given essentially with my hat on, not so much as the Executive Director of Pacific Horticulture, but rather as the CEO of G3, the Green Gardens Group. If you have questions about the watershed approach to landscaping, I'm going to encourage you to take a look at our website, greengardensgroup.com, and feel free to reach out to me personally with questions. We have a lot of resources, and of course, we'll share those with PAC-Hort as well. But I do want to tell you that Pacific Horticulture has been talking about gardeners as superheroes for a long time. There's a particularly wonderful set of articles from 2016. They're compiled actually on our website at pachort.org. And if you go to the archive, you can find these several articles on water-sensitive landscape design, which were written by the Urban Water Group. It is essentially a discussion of the watershed approach, a little bit more in depth about some of the things that I talked about during this talk, and it's a wonderful resource for you that is available, right there on the PAC-Hort website in the archive. But we have even more information than that. Pacific Horticulture has been interested in the environment since 1968, and we have been writing about gardeners as superheroes for this whole time. There are 3 particular articles that I found on the archives, but there are many more. I want to draw your attention to an article from spring of 2014 by Hallie Schmidt called Ocean Friendly Gardening. It's a wonderful recap, very brief, that talks about principles that you can apply to your landscape to keep the oceans clean and your landscapes healthy. There's also a terrific article from April 2012 called Waterwise, An Impossible Dream by Judith Carlson. And I want to really point out this 3rd article from winter 1988 called Greening of the Brown Sward by Russell Beatty. What's cool about that article is it actually recaps an article that was written in 1978 and takes a look at the decade intervening and what has changed in the approach to green infrastructure and to utilizing the principles that we just talked about in an urban setting of San Francisco. But Pacific Horticulture Society, pacifichorticulture.org or pachort.org has a lot of resources. They're available in our archives. There are hundreds of articles. I really encourage you to dig a little deeper and go there and find out more. And I would be remiss in my job at Pacific Horticulture if I did not ask you to please support our mission. There are a lot of ways that you can do that. You could just start out by making sure that you sign up for our newsletter, or you could make a donation to our mission. And you can even be specific by saying, sending us a note and saying, I made a donation and I would really like it to support digital classroom or publications, anything that we do, or just a general donation is certainly appreciated so we can fulfill this mission of showing how landscapes are ground zero in the fight against climate change. And possibly the most important thing you could ever do is become a member of our community. By joining Pacific Horticulture Society, you help us to spread the word. You yourself gain the knowledge that we're sharing all the time, and you become a superhero in not just the landscape, but in our entire region. The way you do that is by going to pachort.org or pacifichorticulture.org. Either way gets you there, and it's easy to click on the button to either become a member, make a donation, or just sign up for our newsletter and stay in touch. I hope you enjoyed this discussion today, and I hope that you will come back and take a look at the other talks that we are producing in the digital classroom. Again, if you have questions or want resources or just want to make a comment, feel free to do so by sending us an email at digitalclassroom@pachort.org. I have very much enjoyed talking to you today. I look forward to interviewing the other people who will be presenting over the course of the year, and I hope you have a very good day. And now you've got to bear with me while I get out of this, this mode.